The judge didn't flinch when he said it. "Lit her skin on fire." That was just one of the lines read aloud in federal court on a winter morning in Milwaukee. Lines that painted a picture far darker than the gold chains and custom rings ever did. By then, the name Pimp Snookie had already rung through the streets like a siren. But inside that courtroom, the vibe was cold. Nobody was talking slick or trying to show out. It was just the weight of everything he did sitting heavy in the room. So how did a man who once stood on Jerry Springer next to two women calling him daddy end up here, stripped of everything but a number on a prison file? This story didn't kick off in no courtroom. It started way before that, deep in the streets, long before the feds came knocking. Back in the mid-'80s and well into the early 2000s, Milwaukee wasn't just another Midwest city trying to bounce back from economic collapse. On the low, it was earning a different kind of reputation, one that didn't show up on tourism brochures. Law enforcement, journalists, and community activists started noticing something unusual. The city was quietly becoming a hub for street-level sex trafficking and pimp-controlled prostitution. Dana World Patterson, chair of Milwaukee's Human Trafficking Task Force, would later refer to it as the Harvard of Pimp School. It wasn't just metaphor because the streets were talking, and what they were saying pointed to a culture, one with rules, hierarchy, and a strange kind of status. Young men in neighborhoods like 35th and Center didn't just dream of rap careers or NBA drafts. Some wanted to be street legends with women in line, cash in their pockets, and respect that stretched state to state. Pimping wasn't just a hustle, it was a full-time lifestyle. The car, the cane, the custom suits, they weren't accessories. They were symbols and markers of arrival. This wasn't accidental. Milwaukee had the ingredients and sat at a major crossroads of interstate travel. A perfect launch pad to Chicago, Indianapolis, even Las Vegas. High poverty rates, housing segregation, weak social systems, and a broken school-to-prison pipeline helped create a pipeline to the game. Vulnerable girls, often runaways or from unstable homes, became the most common targets. Once lured in, they were moved around like property. At the center of all this, there was a network of street players who saw themselves less like criminals and more like entrepreneurs. Derek Avery, the man who would later be known as Pimp Snookie, wasn't the only one, but he was the one that stood out the most. Even before his name hit documentaries or court files, people on the block already knew what he was about. His game wasn't loud in the beginning, it was calculated, and it followed a blueprint. This blueprint was taught and passed down through jail calls, late-night car rides, and older heads showing younger ones how to keep a girl in check. The Players Ball, originally made famous in Chicago, was the high mark of this culture. Milwaukee Pimp showed up in mink coats and gator shoes, hoping to get crowned and bring that glory back home. In 1998, Avery got that crown, Pimp of the Year. For many, that's where his story begins. But the reality is, it started long before the award. The culture that produced Snookie didn't pop out of nowhere. It came from a city with deep social cracks, ones that created room for predators to present themselves as protectors. And when young girls were promised fast money, shopping bags, and someone who called them wifey, it was hard to say no, at least at first. What made Milwaukee unique wasn't just how many pimps operated there, it was how organized the game became. Some ran their girls across state lines, bouncing from Chicago to St. Paul to Vegas. Others stayed local but operated with military precision. Everyone knew who was who, and Snookie, even in the early days, had a reputation for going harder than most. Still, this part of the story ain't about the crimes yet. It's about the city that shaped the man before the headlines did. It's about a place where pimping wasn't just tolerated, sometimes it was admired, and that admiration built a monster. What came next? The grooming, the mind games, the torture. None of it could have happened without this foundation. So before we talk about the girls who vanished, the bathtubs of ice water, or the fire, we gotta stay here for a minute. Because the fall of Pimp Snookie only makes sense when you understand how easy it was for him to rise. And once he started rising, he did it fast. Before the Players Ball crown, before the HBO documentaries, before the courtroom transcripts, Derek Avery was just another kid on Milwaukee's north side. Born and raised in a city where opportunity moved slow and reputation moved fast, his early years didn't make national headlines. But looking back, the blueprint was already forming. He wasn't born a pimp, but by the time he was grown, the game had already carved itself into his mindset. Not much is publicly documented about Avery's exact childhood years. No detailed reports from school records or long interviews with childhood friends. But what does stand out is that by the mid-90s, he was already making noise. By his own admission in later court filings, he had been pimping since at least 1997, although Milwaukee police and victim testimonies trace his activity as far back as 1994. At that point, Avery would have been in his late 20s, not some wide-eyed teenager just trying things out. What made him stand out early on wasn't just his look, though the man had a thing for flash, custom-fitted suits, gold watches, designer shades, and cars that rolled slow enough for everyone to notice. But beneath all that shine was a personality that understood how to command attention. He wasn't just out there chasing money. He was building an image, one that made women stop and look and made other dudes take mental notes. By the late 90s, Avery had adopted the street name Snookie. It stuck quickly. In a world where names carried weight, Snookie meant something. It wasn't loud or cartoonish. It had that soft edge that disarmed people, almost made him seem approachable. And that was part of the trick. Snookie could walk into a room and make you feel like you already knew him, but that familiarity wasn't free. It was calculated. At the time, Milwaukee was already earning its under-the-radar reputation as a breeding ground for traffickers and underground street organizers. Snookie didn't invent the game, but he understood it better than most. He had a way of getting women to listen, to follow, to fold into his world without even realizing it. Victims and witnesses would later describe how smooth he was, how he'd offer clothes, hair appointments, even help with rent or bills, before eventually asking for something back. His early recruitment methods were simple but effective. He scoped out girls who were struggling, runaways, teen moms, girls fresh out of group homes or foster care, and sold them a lifestyle. One victim said later in court, "He was selling me my dreams." That phrase comes up more than once. For a lot of these women, Snookie didn't show up waving fists or barking orders. He showed up with promises, stability, money, protection, even family. In a city where survival was a daily grind, those things held weight. One girl said she first met Snookie when he offered to buy her groceries. Another recalled how he gave her a phone, a new outfit, and took her to get her nails done within 48 hours of meeting her. Then the rules started showing up, subtle at first. Don't talk to other men, don't go out without telling him, stay in his house, and use his phone. Slowly, it became less about gifts and more about control. By 1998, Avery had already developed a reputation that stretched beyond Milwaukee. That was the year he was crowned Pimp of the Year at the Players Ball, an annual gathering of pimps and sex traffickers that drew attendees from Chicago, Atlanta, New York, and California. It had media coverage, dress codes, and trophies. The crown wasn't just a joke or a prop. In those circles, it was currency, and it meant you were certified, and Snookie wore that title like a badge of honor. In that world, image meant everything. The suits, the rings, the cars. They weren't just for show. They were marketing tools. Snookie understood that early. In Milwaukee, his presence turned heads before he even said a word. Candy-painted whips with booming sound systems, custom jewelry with oversized stones. He knew how to use flash to demand respect, even from a distance. But what made him effective wasn't just his look. It was the system underneath it all and his attention to structure. Snookie didn't run things sloppy, and he didn't just bring in women to work for him. He programmed them with strict rules, quotas, loyalty tests. He wasn't just showing these girls the game, he was building a new reality for them. Those recruited by Snookie were trained almost militarily. According to multiple testimonies, the system started immediately with him laying out roles. New girls were schooled by the older ones, women who had already been broken in. They taught you how to move, what to say, how to act, and how to keep your mouth shut. You didn't refer to Snookie by his name. He was daddy at all times. You didn't walk in front of him, you waited until he moved. You didn't make eye contact with other men unless they were clients, and every rule had a purpose. As veteran girls schooled the new ones, some served as enforcers, others handled logistics. It wasn't a loose circle of women trying to survive. It was a system, and Snookie was at the top of it. As Avery's name began to spread through the underground, so did his style of operation. He wasn't the only one moving women through Milwaukee, but he was one of the first to turn it into a multi-state hustle. Chicago, St. Paul, the Dakotas. He began making quiet moves, sometimes under the radar, sometimes not. And while local law enforcement was aware of prostitution activity, the full scope of what was happening stayed hidden for years. Avery never worked alone, but he kept his inner circle tight. He understood loyalty and, more importantly, how to manufacture it. One former recruit said he made it feel like we were a family. You didn't want to disappoint him. That word, family, keeps showing up. It's how Avery kept people close. He called his circle a household. The women weren't just workers, they were wives-in-law. That language made things stick. It blurred the line between control and connection, between business and belonging. It was psychological. It was also strategic. The deeper someone got into his world, the harder it became to leave, especially when money started coming in and girls were seeing cash for the first time in their lives. Add in emotional dependency, isolation from real family, and the fear of starting over, and suddenly you had a system that didn't need chains or handcuffs. It was built on words, loyalty, and fear. These weren't just power plays. In fact, they were techniques meant to erase a woman's independence, piece by piece. The goal was beyond mere obedience. It was mental submission. He wasn't loud with his control, but it ran deep, and he had a way of masking the abuse with affection. Women were told they were part of a family. Snookie wasn't their boss. He was their protector. That illusion kept a lot of girls around longer than they ever expected, and by the time the illusion cracked, they were too far in to leave without consequences. He didn't need to threaten you every day because the system did that for him. By the early 2000s, Avery's hustle was no longer small time. He had storefronts in his name. He had cars registered under his girls. He had bank accounts moving just enough money to avoid attention. He even opened a nightclub, Marginie's, on King Drive. It doubled as a legit business and a front for trafficking income. The paper trail stayed thin, but the streets knew what it was. This was the point where things started to shift. What started as charm and street game had now become a machine, structured, cold, profitable. He wasn't freelancing anymore. He was operating. And as that operation grew, so did the danger. But the story of that danger, the beatings, the torchings, the threats, that comes later. For now, what matters is that the Derek Avery who once stood on corners looking for opportunity had become Snookie, a man with a growing empire, a loyal circle, and a name that carried weight. What came next wasn't luck, it was calculated, and it was just getting started. The street economy operated on daily quotas, and Snookie was no exception. Each girl had a set amount she had to bring in every night. Snookie never allowed his girls to keep a dollar. Everything went to him. He handled their housing, their food, their transportation. On paper, it looked like he was taking care of them. In reality, it was just another way to tighten the leash. If you had nothing of your own, you had no real way to leave. The psychology of it all was layered. One former recruit told investigators that Snookie would alternate between kindness and violence so sharply it made her question her own memory. One night he'd give her a necklace and a new phone. The next night he'd slap her for making eye contact with another man. It kept her confused, disoriented, always trying to get back in his good graces. He controlled not just money and movement, but information. New girls had their phones taken. Address books were confiscated and IDs disappeared. One 17-year-old girl said that Snookie took her ID on the first night and told her plainly, "I know where your father lives." That kind of threat was more than just a scare tactic. It was a line drawn in blood. Later, when that same girl hesitated to follow orders, Snookie made a phone call in front of her. On that call, he offered someone $2,800 to kill her father. Whether that call was real or staged didn't matter because the message landed. He played the long game. Instead of kicking girls out for stepping out of line, he punished them in ways that made them feel small, dependent, and terrified. At this stage in his operation, everything was about control. Girls weren't just trafficked across Milwaukee. They were rotated through Chicago, Miami, the Dakotas, and Indianapolis. Each rotation kept them from putting down roots. If they couldn't build friendships or community ties, they were less likely to run. If they never stayed in one place long enough to be recognized, it was harder for law enforcement to track. The structure wasn't chaotic. It was organized, precise. Snookie didn't move like a street-level hustler. He moved like a businessman. The only difference was the product he moved around. At some point in the early 2000s, Snookie began opening fronts to clean his money. He launched a shoe and clothing boutique, and later a nightclub called Marginie's on King Drive. Both businesses served dual purposes. One, they made him look legit. Two, they helped him move dirty money without raising alarms. Around the same time, his name started showing up in unrelated city corruption probes. Though no charges came from that case, it gave the public its first glimpse at just how far his influence reached. Still, the flash never stopped. Snookie lived like he was invincible, and in many ways, the city let him. Even after making TV appearances, even after being featured in documentaries, showing him leading women on dog leashes, even after national exposure, He kept moving like the rules didn't apply to him. To the casual viewer, it might have looked like a character, some kind of street performance, but those who lived under him knew it wasn't an act. They knew that it was real. By this point, Snookie wasn't just running a group of women. He was running a full organization where roles were assigned. Power was delegated, and at the center of that hierarchy was one name that kept coming up: Shamika Evans. Known on the street as Mika, she had started under Avery as a teen and grown into his most trusted associate. Over time, she became his bottom girl, a term used to describe the highest-ranking woman in a pimp stable. She enforced rules, handled discipline, and trained new girls. She was the closest to Snookie and the most loyal. But that loyalty came with a price, and what she endured to stay in that position would later make headlines of its own. We'll get into that, because while the operation looked bulletproof from the outside, inside the walls, things were already starting to rot. To the outside world, Pimp Snookie was sharp. The cars, the suits, the charisma, the jokes on Springer, he played the part well. Even when he looked serious, he still had that swagger, the type of presence that made people lean in, not back away. But the real Snookie didn't live in front of cameras. The real Snookie came out behind closed doors, and what happened there rarely made it to tape. This was the side of Derek Avery that the gold rings couldn't hide. The side that left scars, silence, and court files filled with horror. Federal prosecutors, witnesses, and victims later pieced together what Avery's carefully crafted image concealed. His control wasn't just psychological, it was physical, methodical, and violent. Inside his circle, the rules weren't optional. He set them, and if you broke one, even slightly, you paid for it. Snookie didn't raise his voice often, but he didn't need to. Punishment was baked into the structure. Girls weren't just expected to perform sex acts and hand over the cash. They had to maintain a posture of submission at all times, and when someone slipped, he made sure the rest of them saw what happened next. One of Avery's most common tactics was to stage punishments like lessons. It was never just about one girl, it was about all the others watching. Witnesses say he often called it training, but what happened didn't look like any kind of training most people could stomach. Take the hot treatment. Several survivors described a routine where Avery would pour rubbing alcohol onto a woman's bare skin and set it on fire. The flames didn't last long, but that wasn't the point. He wasn't trying to burn skin off. He was trying to leave something else behind. The fear, the uncertainty, the idea that if you stepped out of line, anything could happen to you. Then there was the cold treatment, another punishment used when someone talked back or missed a quota. The girl would be forced to strip and sit in a bathtub filled with ice water. Avery would stand nearby and light a cigarette. When the cigarette burned out, the punishment was over. Until then, she sat there shaking. One victim said her body went numb, but she stayed still because moving made things worse. These weren't rare occurrences. They were patterns. Snookie didn't act on impulse. He acted on routine, and every tactic he used had one goal: break you down so you wouldn't question him again. Avery also favored tools because his hands weren't enough. Broomsticks, pool cues, metal chairs, leather belts, whatever was nearby became a weapon. One woman said he once beat her so badly with a broomstick that it shattered, so he grabbed the metal handle and kept going until it bent. She later said her body was 5 different colors from the bruises. He didn't stop because she begged. He stopped when he was done. Another woman told investigators that Avery would slap her across the face using the back of his hand, rings turned inward to maximize the pain. The point wasn't just physical punishment, it was humiliation. One of the more chilling cases involved a 14-year-old girl who had been trafficked across state lines. She was accused of talking to another pimp, something Avery considered betrayal. In response, he didn't yell or give a warning. He pulled out a knife and stabbed her repeatedly in the buttocks. The wounds were deep, the scars stayed, and that wasn't the only time he used knives. While most of his abuse was focused on beatings, fire, and ice, some reports from victims hinted at deeper forms of control, including threats of mutilation and the use of sharp objects to make sure rules were never broken twice. He controlled them not just through violence, but through deep psychological pressure. Many of the girls were terrified, not only for themselves but for the safety of their loved ones. That kind of fear gave him power, and most of them did whatever it took to stay out of danger. Many of the victims were teenagers when they met Avery. They weren't just vulnerable because of age. They were isolated, cut off from family, lacking any real support system. That made the grooming process easier and the violence more effective. He didn't just want obedience, he wanted worship. Some of the girls testified that they were required to say, "Yes, Daddy," to every instruction, no matter how small. If Avery walked into a room, they were supposed to stop what they were doing and focus on him. If they served him food, it had to be on separate plates, one item per dish. If he asked for water, it had to be cold. If the ashtray was full, it had to be emptied before he noticed. These details sound petty until you realize they weren't about convenience. They were about domination. He wanted full control of his space, his image, and the people around him. Some girls were also expected to act as personal assistants, clean his house, wash his clothes, and brush his hair. One victim said she was forced to shave his face each morning. She said she hated the sound of the razor, but she was more afraid of messing up. Inside his system, the abuse wasn't just accepted, it was normalized. There were days when a girl would get hit and the rest of the house would act like it didn't happen. Not because they didn't care, but because they knew better that one mistake could bring the same punishment down on them. Shamika Evans, his longtime partner and eventual bottom girl, was perhaps the most complex figure in this system. She played multiple roles in his operation, serving his enforcer, his recruiter, and at times, his victim. Court documents would later reveal that Avery beat her too, often more severely than anyone else. He knocked out her front teeth, burned her with cigarettes, and forced her to manage other girls while dealing with her own trauma. She carried visible scars from the abuse, along with deep emotional wounds shaped by years of control and involvement in Avery's operation. At the time, she didn't speak out. She defended him, protected him, and helped him. She even covered for him during earlier investigations. But later, when the walls closed in, she would be the one to turn on him. All of this, the fire, the ice, the threats, the silence, was kept hidden for years because the image of Snookie was loud enough to drown out the truth. The man who flexed on Jerry Springer, the one who posed in fur coats for documentaries, was always more marketable than the man behind the locked door. The federal case revealed serious allegations supported by detailed, consistent accounts that were verified by multiple sources. These were not isolated claims. They formed a clear, corroborated pattern. And the courts didn't buy the argument that it was all just a persona. Because what happened behind those doors didn't look like a hustle. It looked like torture. And for the girls inside, it didn't feel like a lifestyle. It felt like prison with no bars. Avery once told a documentary crew, "Let me pimp or let me die." The girls who lived with him were forced to consider a different question: survive him or disappear, and many of them nearly did. What made it worse was how long it all lasted. From the mid-90s to the late 2000s, Snookie operated in plain sight. Despite the abuse, despite the scars, despite the whispers, no one shut it down, because most of what he did was disguised as discipline, and the street don't ask questions when the money's still flowing. In the late 1990s, Derek Avery didn't just control the block, he started stepping in front of the camera. While most people in his position kept things quiet, he leaned into the spotlight. For reasons still debated to this day, Snookie didn't hide from media attention. He invited it and used it to his advantage. His first real taste of mainstream exposure came through the tabloid circus of daytime television. He and several of his girls made an appearance on the Jerry Springer Show sometime during that period, showcasing their lifestyle to a national audience. The women sat beside him, calling him the best man they'd ever known, while he played up his image for the crowd. It was loud, chaotic, and over the top, but that was Springer's whole brand, and for Snookie, it was free PR. The deeper move came in 1999 when Avery was featured in the HBO documentary Pimp's Up, Hoes Down. Directed by Brent Owens, the film followed several men across the country who built their lives around the pimping subculture. Some critics saw it as glamorizing the lifestyle, while others believed it was simply documenting what was already out there. Either way, it gave Avery national visibility. In the documentary, Snookie shows off his custom clothes, oversized rings, and polished shoes. He speaks in metaphors, drops pimp logic, and flashes a ring molded into the shape of a small pimp figure holding women on leashes. It's not subtle. He calls it a symbol of serious game. At one point, Avery looks directly into the camera and delivers the line that would follow him for the rest of his life: "Let me pimp or let me die." The quote got replayed in forums, reviews, and eventually courtrooms. But what really shifted things wasn't Springer or Pimp's Up, Hoes Down. It was what came next, a British-produced documentary that aired on Channel 4 in the UK in 2000. The film, titled simply Pimp Snookie, was shot over a year by filmmaker Clive Gordon, who followed Avery closely through the streets of Milwaukee, and captured his daily operations. Unlike HBO's treatment, this wasn't all glitz. It didn't edit around the ugly parts. In fact, it leaned into them. What Gordon caught on camera didn't just blur the line between showmanship and abuse, it erased it. One of the most disturbing moments comes early in the film when Avery is seen recruiting a teenage girl named Mika, real name Shamika Evans. She was around 18 at the time. Viewers see him driving his Mercedes, spotting her on the sidewalk, and pulling over to make conversation. With a confident smile, he says into the camera, "Gonna find me a new girl today." What follows is an unsettling play-by-play of psychological grooming. Avery flatters her, jokes with her, offers her promises. She laughs, a little nervous, but engaged, and she accepts the ride. Not long after, she's at his house, eating food, taking in the atmosphere, and being introduced to his other girls. That same documentary then documents Mika's transformation, from wide-eyed newcomer to submissive recruit. Viewers can see her body language changes, her tone softens, and within days, she's following orders. But the most alarming scene comes later, when Avery sets up a test. He instructs his 19-year-old nephew to try seducing Mika as a way to check her loyalty. The camera catches everything, the advance, the kiss, the fallout. When Avery finds out she kissed his nephew, he snaps. What happens next is caught on camera. Snookie storms into the room and headbutts Mika in the forehead. She stumbles, looks dazed, and then he begins yelling, pacing, threatening. He's halfway through another outburst before the reality of the camera sets in. In that moment, he looks at the lens, his voice drops, his body stiffens, and for a split second, the mask flickers. You can almost see him deciding what to do next. But instead of backing off entirely, he tries to justify himself. He tells the documentarian, "I'm not no crazy, sadistic, messed up in the head fool." But the footage already said otherwise. Avery knew the camera was right there, but he wasn't hiding nothing. He said yes to that footage, stood right in front of the lens like it was all part of the plan. Back then, he really believed he was showing power, like he was running things the right way. In his head, that was boss behavior, not something that was going to come back and bite. Other moments from the Pimp Snookie documentary reinforce the twisted duality of his world. In one scene, he laughs as he explains how his girls bring in thousands of dollars each week. In another, he lectures them about loyalty, comparing their bond to royalty. He claims to treat them like queens, so they need to treat him like a king. All the while, his voice stays calm, and his movements are deliberate. It's not a man in a rage, it was a man performing control. One reviewer from The Guardian later called the film infuriating, depressing, and unforgettable. The critic wrote that it was a rare and deeply uncomfortable glimpse into the underworld, a world where words like family, love, and loyalty were twisted into tools of manipulation. At one point in the documentary, Avery tries to explain why he does what he does. He claims that the game is all he knows. He says, "People think this is about hate, but it's about structure." He speaks about how he came up, how nobody gave him anything, and how pimping gave him identity. And then he offers one of the most revealing statements of the film, "This ain't me, I'm playing a role." It was a line he would return to again years later, in court, in prison letters, and online blogs, a claim that everything, the violence, the titles, the trafficking, was performance. That it was all just for show, but as viewers saw in real time, the cameras didn't show an actor. They showed a man living the life he created, one that didn't end when the film wrapped. And when it came time to face consequences, that line, "I'm playing a role," became the heart of his defense, a defense that couldn't survive the facts that came next. By the early to mid-2000s, Milwaukee had become too familiar. Snookie had already run the streets, built his brand, and soaked up the attention from local and national media. But heat was building, whispers were turning into investigations, and Avery, always thinking 3 moves ahead, started looking west. That's when Las Vegas came into the picture, a city already flooded with cash, tourists, and a nonstop demand for adult entertainment. It was the perfect place to scale up. Avery didn't just relocate to Vegas for the weather. According to federal documents, by 2004 he was actively shifting his operations base to Nevada, setting up shop while maintaining links to his Milwaukee network. He started investing in businesses that could both support his lifestyle and wash his street money. IRS reports would later show he moved money through fronts like car leasing companies and home rental businesses. From the outside, it looked like a man transitioning into entrepreneurship. But the reality behind those doors was still trafficking. In Vegas, Snookie upgraded his game. The stakes were higher, the money was faster, and the market was wide open. Federal investigators would later confirm that Avery was still flying women from Milwaukee to work for him in Nevada and beyond. He used a network of loyal drivers and recruiters to move his girls between cities like Chicago, Miami, Oklahoma City, and Fargo. The schedule was tight. Sometimes they only stayed in one city long enough to make money and disappear. The mobility made it harder for victims to build support systems or reach out for help. Constant travel meant isolation. One of the teenage girls Avery trafficked in the early 2000s told authorities she was sent from Milwaukee to Chicago 7 nights a week, then later to Las Vegas when her quota got bumped to thousands per night. Quotas were a central part of Snookie's Vegas setup. In Milwaukee, his girls were already expected to bring in $500 to $1,500 a night, depending on location and demand. In Vegas, the expectations jumped even higher. One victim said she was expected to pull $5,000 in a single night, with no days off. Every dollar went directly to Avery, and if they came up short, it wasn't just a lecture, it was punishment. One detail that stood out during court proceedings was how much strategy Snookie put into keeping law enforcement off his back. He rarely used his real name for rentals or utilities. Properties were often leased in other people's names, usually the women in his stable. Car titles, bank accounts, and even phones were kept under aliases or rotated frequently. The goal was to avoid creating a direct link between Avery and the criminal activity. But hiding in plain sight has limits. Around 2008, Avery's name popped up again in Milwaukee, this time in connection with the city corruption scandal. A local alderman had allegedly tried to solicit a bribe from Avery in exchange for help securing a liquor license for one of his businesses. Avery reportedly offered to fly the official to Las Vegas to work things out. While Avery wasn't charged in the incident, it was another sign that his operations weren't as discreet as he thought. In Vegas, he also expanded his use of false fronts. Clothing boutiques, bars, car rentals, anything that could absorb cash and make it look clean. But even as the businesses grew, so did his need for control. Witnesses said the punishments didn't stop in Milwaukee. They followed him. Ice baths, beatings, rules enforced with metal rods. The same tactics kept his girls in line, no matter how far they traveled. One former associate told investigators that Vegas actually made Snookie worse. The money was so good and the girls were so replaceable that he started treating his recruits like machines. If one broke down, there was always another one waiting. He also started tightening his grip in new ways. The more the women relied on him, the harder it became to leave. And that's when he leaned into something even more manipulative: pregnancy. According to case files and victim testimonies, Avery got multiple girls in his circle pregnant. Some had one child by him, others had more. He later claimed to have 26 kids in total, though outside reports estimate the number somewhere between 15 and 20. Regardless of the exact figure, the strategy was clear. The babies weren't about love or family, they were leverage. Avery believed that once a girl had a child by him, she was less likely to run. She'd be tied to him financially and emotionally, especially if the child needed support. Even if she wanted to leave the game, she'd think twice before taking his child and disappearing. For a man obsessed with control, this tactic gave him a different kind of grip. One woman told the court she worked for Avery for years and had 3 of his children. Another said she continued working while pregnant, sometimes across multiple cities. The idea was to keep moving, keep earning, and never give her time to think or recover. What this revealed wasn't just cruelty, it was organization. Snookie knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't beat women out of rage. He didn't impregnate them by accident. He created a system where fear, isolation, and dependency worked in his favor. And in Vegas, where law enforcement was stretched thin and the volume of cases made it hard to track every victim, he found room to keep growing. By the late 2000s, that expansion would come to a halt. But during his run, Avery operated one of the most disciplined, brutal, and geographically wide-ranging trafficking rings ever documented in federal court out of Milwaukee. And a big part of what kept that machine running was the use of children, not just as offspring, but as tools to anchor women in place. Because when you tie a woman to a man through a child and then take away her money, her ID, and her support system, it becomes less about choice and more about survival. And that's exactly how he wanted it. By the time federal agents moved in, Derek Avery had been operating for over a decade. His name had already shown up in Milwaukee police files, local gossip, city corruption probes, and national documentaries. But up until the late 2000s, Nothing had stuck. He moved just enough, cleaned just enough money, and intimidated just enough people to keep law enforcement chasing shadows. But that changed around 2008, when the feds decided they had seen enough. That year, a joint task force involving the FBI, Milwaukee Police, and the IRS Criminal Division quietly began building a case against Avery. It wasn't a rush job. This was slow work, done over months, sometimes years, with investigators pulling pieces together from court transcripts, pawn shop receipts, travel records, and witness testimony. The inclusion of IRS agents signaled that the government wasn't just looking to catch Avery on trafficking charges, they were following the money too. The grand jury process started behind closed doors. Subpoenas were issued, and victims were located. Some of them were already in the system, picked up during prostitution stings or traffic stops. Others were tracked down across state lines. In total, at least 7 women came forward to testify about their time with Avery. That number was unusually high for a trafficking case, especially one that spanned so many years in cities. Their stories weren't vague, they were detailed, and most of them matched. They talked about the ice baths, the beatings, the quotas, the pregnancies, and the mental games. One woman described being forced to sit in a tub of freezing water while Avery smoked a cigarette nearby. Another recounted being stabbed in the buttocks for talking to another man. A third said he knocked out her front teeth during an argument about money. Most of the women had been silent for years, keeping their heads down and staying out the way. But when word got out that Avery was finally under real heat, a few of them stepped forward. They weren't chasing no spotlight, they just knew it was time to speak up. Not everybody talked, but enough did. On August 5, 2009, federal agents arrested Derek Avery in Las Vegas. He wasn't alone. With him were Shamika Evans, then 28, and another woman who was not charged. Avery was indicted on 3 counts of sex trafficking of minors, and Evans was hit with 2. The charges carried potential life sentences, but this was just the beginning. By December, the grand jury returned with a superseding indictment that added 12 more counts. The case now included allegations that Avery trafficked 2 underage girls and 10 adult women between 2001 and 2008 using force, fraud, and coercion. He was also accused of conspiracy, attempted witness tampering, and financial crimes. One of the more serious allegations involved Avery trying to bribe a witness during the early stages of the investigation. According to prosecutors, he paid one woman $1,000 to influence her testimony. They also claimed he coached some of the other girls on what to say if called before the grand jury. Still, Avery didn't fold, at least not right away. He denied everything and claimed he was not a pimp, had never been a pimp, and that the persona people knew as Pimp Snookie was just a character. He told the court, "I was acting." But while Avery was holding his ground, something shifted behind the scenes. Shamika Evans, the same woman who had been riding with him for over 10 years, the one who helped manage his women, collect quotas, and discipline new recruits, started to talk. Initially, she refused to testify. Even after being locked up in 2009, she stayed quiet. Her lawyer said it wasn't her decision, it was Avery's. He had conditioned her to protect him no matter what. But after 10 months in jail, Evans changed course. She reached a plea deal with the prosecution in mid-2010. On paper, she pled guilty to conspiracy to sex traffic by force. In exchange, she agreed to cooperate. But her cooperation wasn't just 1 or 2 meetings. According to court records, Evans sat with federal agents and Milwaukee police for 8 full days, detailing the structure of Avery's operation from the inside out. She confirmed that she met Avery during the filming of the 1999 documentary. She described how she went from a teenage recruit to his bottom girl. She admitted to helping him collect personal information on new girls, so he could later use it for threats. She explained the quota system, the punishments, the pregnancies, and the out-of-state trips. She told them how it all worked. Her testimony lined up with what the other victims had said, but it went further. She knew the full picture. She had lived it. Photos of Evans submitted to the court showed scars across her body, cigarette burns, bruises, evidence of long-term abuse. She wasn't just a co-defendant, she was also a top-tier victim. Her shift, from loyal soldier to key witness, was a turning point in the case, and behind that testimony was a body that told its own story. By late 2011, Derek Avery's world had gotten real small. With over a dozen charges stacked against him, multiple women prepared to testify, and his former bottom girl Shamika Evans now cooperating with the feds, Avery was boxed in. The stories coming out were no longer just street gossip or blurred faces in documentaries. They were lined up, on record, and matched with names, dates, scars, and receipts. At this point, Avery tried to pivot. His new legal strategy leaned heavily into the idea that he had been misunderstood. He started telling anyone who would listen that Pimp Snookie wasn't real, just a character, a role he played, a street persona exaggerated for the sake of entertainment. His defense team tried to spin a new angle in court, claiming he wasn't just some street boss. He said he had actually worked with the feds. According to him, during his time in Vegas, he had passed information to the FBI about other players moving through the city, like he was doing them a favor. He made it sound like he was plugged in on both sides, like he had some kind of understanding with the government. He didn't provide names, paperwork, or proof, just that vague talk that he'd been feeding agents intel while running his own game. His defense leaned heavy on this narrative, hoping it would add some kind of layer to the image he'd already built. But it was shaky from the jump. Nobody in law enforcement backed the story, and the court didn't take the bait. To the prosecutors, it was just more smoke from a man trying to duck real time. Assistant U.S. Attorney Joseph Wall made it clear, even if Avery had passed information to law enforcement in the past, it didn't change the reality of his actions. He has never had any shame about what he has done or how he made his money, Wall said, dismissing the informant defense as noise. Behind the scenes, discussions shifted toward a plea deal. The evidence was overwhelming. Avery had appeared on camera verbally and physically abusing women. His name was on documents tied to money laundering. Victim testimony was airtight. There was no clean exit here, only damage control. On November 18, 2011, Derek Avery pleaded guilty to 2 felony counts in federal court in Milwaukee. The first was conspiracy to engage in sex trafficking by force. The second was sex trafficking of a child by force, fraud, or coercion. As part of the deal, prosecutors dropped the remaining charges and agreed not to pursue a life sentence. In exchange, Avery had to admit to the core facts of the operation, that he ran a multi-state trafficking ring, used violence and threats to control women and minors, and profited from their exploitation. In court, Avery spoke briefly. He didn't break down. He didn't apologize to victims. Instead, he repeated what had become his go-to message, that the media had confused Derek Avery with his on-screen persona, that Pimp Snookie wasn't the real him. "One day I'm going to explain who Pimp Snookie really was," he said, hinting again at the idea that his public image was nothing more than branding. But the court wasn't swayed by philosophy. The judge assigned to Avery's case was Lynn Edelman, a respected federal judge known for handling high-profile criminal matters. When sentencing day arrived on February 22, 2012, the courtroom was full. Avery's family was there, including some of his children and the women who had borne them. So were survivors, police investigators, journalists, and federal agents who had worked the case for years. Judge Edelman read out portions of the plea deal, repeating what Avery had admitted to, that he forced women into sex work, trafficked girls as young as 14, and used brutal methods to keep them under control. The court heard about the ice water punishments, the broomstick beatings, the cigarette burns, and the death threats against victims' families. It wasn't new information, but hearing it read aloud in a federal courtroom made it official. One of the most emotional moments in the courtroom came when Patricia Myers, the grandmother of one of Avery's victims, stepped up to speak. Her voice was shaky but firm, like someone who had carried too much pain for too long. She talked about how her granddaughter disappeared for months. No calls, no updates, no trace. When they finally found her, she wasn't the same girl. The light in her eyes was gone, her spirit beaten down, and her body covered in bruises. Patricia faced Avery straight on and told him without flinching, "You took everything from her, including her pride, her human dignity." And for a second, the courtroom went still. That moment cut through every lie Avery had tried to float, that he was just acting, that he was some kind of informant for the feds. Patricia wasn't buying none of that. She saw the real damage up close, and she said what needed to be said. Avery didn't respond, but his family wasn't quiet. One of his oldest daughters stood up in court and spoke for him, her voice shaking but steady enough to push through. She told the judge that the man she knew wasn't some heartless monster, but a present, supportive father who never turned his back on her. "He was always there for me, emotionally and spiritually," she said, holding back tears. She called him a misunderstood genius who got caught up in the street life, not the inconsiderate or evil man the court had been describing. "He is a genius who was taken by the street," she said, asking the court to show mercy. She said he always listened when she needed him, gave her advice, and was the kind of dad who showed up for her, even if the world painted him different. It was raw and emotional, a rare moment where Avery wasn't just a defendant. He was somebody's father. Judge Adelman acknowledged the family's pain but stayed focused on the victims. He said the sentence had to reflect not just what Avery did, but how long he did it and how many lives were affected. Ultimately, Adelman handed down a 20-year sentence, one of the longest ever issued in Wisconsin for a sex trafficking case at the time. It was a sentence that reflected years of abuse, manipulation, and interstate crime. And with that ruling, the man who once strutted across stage lights in fur coats and custom rings was walked out of court in a plain jumpsuit and cuffs. The game was over, and his final sentence, 20 years in federal prison. In the years following his sentencing, Derek Avery faded from public view. He was transferred into the federal prison system, where he's still serving his time today. No tell-all interview, no redemption arc, no public apology, just silence. But the damage he left behind still echoes through the streets of Milwaukee and every city where his name once meant something. Several of his victims have tried to rebuild their lives, though the trauma runs deep. Some moved out of state, others changed their names. A few stayed in Milwaukee and got involved in advocacy, sharing pieces of their story to help others avoid the same traps. The city's anti-trafficking task force, launched in part due to cases like Avery's, has since expanded its efforts, training officers and community members to spot red flags earlier. As for Shamika Evans, her cooperation helped secure Avery's conviction, but it didn't erase her past. She served time, then quietly disappeared from headlines. Her testimony, chilling and detailed, remains one of the most comprehensive inside accounts of a modern-day sex trafficking ring ever recorded in Wisconsin. Avery's story also sparked wider discussions about the glamorization of pimp culture in media. His appearance in a national documentary, his smooth-talking persona, the expensive cars and clothes, it all created a false image of power and control. But behind it was violence, fear, and broken lives. The feds said Avery ran one of the most structured and abusive trafficking operations they'd ever seen. And yet for years, he kept it going with barely a scratch on his record. That alone says something about the systems that failed to stop him earlier, and the silence that kept him protected. His victims weren't weak, they were trapped, not by chains, but by fear, manipulation, and false promises, and even now some still haven't found their way out. So what do you call a man who dressed like a legend, talked like a boss, and lived like a star, but built it all on pain? That's the question Milwaukee had to face when Pimp Snookie finally fell. And maybe the real story here isn't just about his rise or his fall, but about the women who survived him because they're the ones still here, still standing, still healing.